Hello everyone, this is Kat and welcome back to My Hero Academia Podfics. This is the continuation of Deku and Death. This is part 42, chapter 42, entitled, In Your Blood You Know What's Right. Midori stood slowly, careful not to make any sharp movements that could cut the tense air of the alley. The hero killer stayed equally still, eyeing him up and down like he recognized him from somewhere. He couldn't help the shiver that ran down his spine, but hid it under a guise of ferocity and shadow. The temperature around him dropped noticeably, and Midori had lowered his head to his shoulders, hiding more of his face with the shield that was his collar and hat. "Look, before you say anything, I am sorry." Kami spoke nervously, like there was not a bigger issue before them. I could not bear to be so far, so I simply trailed out of sight. The thought of leaving your side is unwelcome." The teen gritted his teeth, biting back a sigh. "We'll talk about this later, but right now we have bigger problems," he whispered under his breath in short murmurs. "Glad you're here now, but don't mistake that for acceptance." Midori took a boldly terrified step forward, pivoting slightly to shield Ida with his body. The villain didn't seem to react. He chose not to, but Midori kept his eyes trained on him anyway. "Ida, can you move?" he asked just a hair louder than before, just so the hero killer could overhear. "There's a group of pros near Hosu city center." Ida let out a scoff against the dirt. "I can't move my body. Wouldn't be lying here if I could." Midori flinched, but otherwise didn't respond to his friend's harshness. He figured that was the case, but some naive part of him had hoped that Ida would be different from all the other heroes that he'd seen in his premonitions, all lifelessly struck in a fixed stance as they allowed the hero killer to end them. He stole some glances back, taking in Ida's condition. Other than a nasty stab wound to his upper arm, he seemed all right, if he could be even called that, with such an ugly look on his face. The strange paralysis had to be the work of the hero killer's quirk somehow, but how did it activate? It seemed to be the murderer's one trump card. He only needed to catch his victims off guard long enough to paralyze them, but without knowing how to avoid the activation, he was in a fairly bad spot. He started to look around for anything that could prove useful, and was that another person? There was someone else here, slumped against the alley wall. They were dressed in costume, but Midori didn't recognize them. A hero? It was more likely than not. And then all of his overwhelming thoughts had flooded into his brain. He hadn't had another hero-killer premonition since Ida's. What would have happened to this hero if Ida had listened and never sought out the villain? Were they supposed to just die today anyway? He refused to accept that. He'd had a vision for every hero-killer death so far, unless he hadn't, unless there were others, unless there was some that he never even had a chance to save to begin with. No, he refused. Aizawa would have told him, right? "Kami," the hushed mutter had returned. "Check on them." The ghost had followed his successor's gaze, then wordlessly floating over to the downed individual. Midori eerily looked back toward the hero killer, who still hadn't said a word regarding his impromptu arrival, but that was fine. Maybe he could still catch him off guard. He was sure the villain wouldn't expect an invisible force to pick up the other person as Midori hauled Ida out of the alley at the same time. He'd be making some problems for himself, sure, but if he could get them out of here without the risk of fighting, he'd take that in a heartbeat. No one needed to die today. No one was going to die today. "He is breathing and conscious," Kami called out. "Definitely a hero, but he has been stabbed and is likely also unable to move." The ghost instinctively had started shifting back to his successor. "I do not think that he is light enough for me to lift completely off the ground, however, and the villain before us would certainly catch up if I tried to drag him away. Damn it, if that guy was too heavy for Kami, then Ida, decked out in all his armor, wouldn't be any better either. There was no way to run away from this, not without someone being killed. A phantom screech of bloody metal had rang out in his ears. He would have to stay and fight. No one was going to die today. "Midoriya." The teen jolted at his name, especially at the loathing way that it dripped from Ida's lips. "Stop interfering." Ida seethed through clenched teeth. "I want nothing to do with you." "I don't really care. I'm not pretending to be anyone's friend." Midori shook off the memory. Ida didn't really mean it. He was just going to snap him out of it. He wasn't going to lose him, too. It was then when the hero killer finally chose to interfere, letting out a chuckle that stained Midori's ears eternally. Charging in with such a declaration, how selfless. The villain had sauntered forward, cocking his head with a sickening crack. "However, I have a duty to kill these men, and if you butt in, of course, it is the weak that shall be culled." He looked up, piercing through Midori's soul with a metallic glint in his eye, just as cold and sharp. "Now then, what will you do?" An uncontrollable shake of fear had racked the teen's body, breaking him out in a cold sweat. Rotted flesh and blood hid his nose. Rust clawed at his eyes, the taste of soiled metal filled his mouth, a mouth that was no longer his, all as a scraping of swords and cries of mercy flooded his ears and enveloped his thoughts. He wanted to grab at his hair and tear it out until he could finally focus on something else, but he couldn't get his shaking hands to obey him at all. What a pathetic coward he was, to tremble at something that he could never truly experience. He could never die by the hero-killer's sword, but the very thought alone had terrified him. A cold squeeze to his shoulder brought him back to reality. You have to focus. You have to stall long enough that Gran Torino realizes that you are missing until he comes to find you. Kami was right again. He had a win condition here. However small of a light it truly was. He had to protect Ida and the other hero. He had to stall for time. He had to outlast the man who had murdered 17 heroes in cold blood, and not a single one more. I've known that my whole life. That was the easy part. He'd fight forever if he had to. Ida suddenly yelling from behind him. Stop! Leave! This has nothing to do with you! Midoriya gripped his fist, caught between fear and fury, between distress and dismay. You can say all the hateful things you want, Ida, but I'm not going anywhere. He raised his hands up to his chest and slowly released the tension he was holding. But I have so much I want to say to you. The words choked on his longing and loss. I'll save it for later. He settled into a careful stance against the villain, palms stretched forward and flat, knees bent ever so slightly, a pained grimace on his face. Fear haunted his eyes, from crying himself to sleep after the USJ attack, from crying himself to sleep upon staring at the scar Shigaraki engraved into his wrist, from crying himself to sleep every time that he woke from his hero-killer nightmares. I refused to leave. As a Wari, I made a promise. He was by no means brave, not like how he pretended to be at the USJ, or as he gave himself his ever-longing reputation through a name. Here he was, an unkillable boy, scared of what? Dying? He couldn't die, but that didn't erase his fear. I think that's really admirable, Midori. He was afraid. I like it. It's a cute name. Friendly, just like you. Of what he could not name. Let's be unbreakable together. But he could be scared and fight. I want people to know that I'll fight forever for that ending if I have to. Because fear fueled him to make his greatest promise. I'm fighting for a happy ending, forever and beyond if that's what it takes. One he would not let fear destroy. Midori winced as the hero-killer had cackled, his murderous smile glinting amongst the darkness. He spared the boy one last terrifying look before rushing at him with his sword drawn. Kami, protect Ida and the other hero, he commanded in such a harsh hiss that it would have been heard if not for the sound of the murderer's frightening advance, and thankfully that was all it took for the ghost to move back. He understood the situation enough to not question the uncharacteristically aggressive order. The hero-killer held his sword out wide as he approached, preparing to strike in what looked to be a painfully obvious arch, but Midori knew better. There was no way he could have racked up such a body count if his fighting style was that rookie-like. The villain specialized not in the unexpected, but the unknown. It was clear that his quirk could paralyze others, but how it did was so unknown. The same likely applied to his fighting style. There was no question he would strike, but how? Keeping the idea of a feint in mind, Midori still had to avoid the equally dangerous slash heading straight for him. He bent his knees roughly, and with a sudden snap he rocketed forward, with a double blast closing the gap between them almost instantly. His mind shivered unconsciously, but at least the sword couldn't strike him while he was so close. The hero-killer had paused in his advance so subtly Midori almost missed it, but he could clearly notice the widening in his stance, a preparation to strike. The teen instinctually had shrunk in on himself, and with another set of blasts he dived under the hero-killer's legs, now just as wide as the space under the couch that he had sought refuge with in his spar against Gran Torino. Out of the corner of his eye he barely caught the glint of a dagger thrust right at where his abdomen once was. Quickly, Midoriya spun back around to try and blast the villain away from behind, but he underestimated the hero-killer's reaction time, because, as he did, he only saw the sword from before, doubling back to slice him in two. His outstretched palms from previous plan had acted on their own, flexing naturally to summon his scythe. He gripped hard on the handle, holding it out horizontally to block the incoming slash. The sword came crashing down, but not into Midoriya's flesh, but rather the wood of the scythe. They struggled in a stalemate, neither willing to retreat from the forceful fight for dominance. The hero-killer held immense strength Midori hadn't expected, and for as much adrenaline rushing through his blood, he knew if he changed nothing, he would lose. The murderer, however, clearly hadn't expected the sudden new weapon either, bloodshot eyes widening before his mouth once again cracked into a smile. A scythe? Heroes don't typically use those kinds of weapons. The comment might have made him flinch another time, but right now Midori was too focused on the fleeting strength that he had as he tried to hold back the sword. His arms were shaking profusely, sweat dripping down his forehead, muscles screaming in distress. He couldn't hold much longer. But if he gave in and tried to retreat, he doubted the hero killer would give him any amount of breathing room. Midori suddenly abandoned his grip, opening his palms once again, still pressed into his scythe, however. But before the hero killer could take advantage of his lax grip, the teen fired off a double blast, rocketing his scythe right at him. The long handle immediately caught the villain in the throat, sending him flying with it from the momentum right into the alley wall. He just as quickly unsummoned his scythe before the hero killer could try to use it on him instead. He remained on the defensive, repositioning himself to better shield Ida. Regardless of how his paralysis quirk had activated, any kind of stab wound could just as easily put him out of commission, and without immediate backup, Midori just couldn't afford that risk. The hero killer noticed he wasn't going to attack him unless prompted, and so, still with a smile that shook Midori to his core, he charged forward again. Midori could recognize the feint very easily now, the villain rushing him almost the same as before. He could try and dodge again, but it was likely the hero killer expected that now. He needed to stay unpredictable, keeping the murderer guessing long enough until Gran Torino hopefully came looking for him. The teen summoned his scythe again, eliciting another spark of excitement from his opponent. He only held it in one hand this time, struggling to hide how difficult it was to hold, though, to such an expert swordsman like the hero killer, Midori was sure that he could tell regardless. Despite that, he ran forward to meet the opposing blade, collecting just enough momentum to put some power behind what would have been a pitifully weak swing. The strike was obvious, but the hero killer either didn't notice or didn't care, allowing Midori to knock the sword out of his hand. He didn't stop, however, sliding a small dagger out of his sleeve and into his other free hand. Expecting something like that, Midori countered with a feint of his own, quickly raising his free hand and firing off a point-blank blast right at the villain's arm. The shock wave forced the hero killer's hand with the dagger back for a moment, blowing up dust from the alley floor to surround them. But even amongst the cloudy air, a set of murderously excited eyes had pierced through, immediately sending Midori straight back into his fear. The hero killer was too close, way too close. Something primal bloomed in his heart, the ancient taste of predatory fear, and that was more than enough for Midori to act upon his ancient instinct, get the hell away or make him get the hell away. Midori swung out a leg without a thought, roundhouse kicking the villain in the side. He pressed the iron tip of his boot hard into his flesh, really making sure to dig it in as he sent the hero killer tumbling away. He didn't realize how much of a critical mistake he'd made until the shine of a small dagger had cut through the dust, and a small burning sensation erupted from his calf. Midori recoiled as the remnants of his blast finally cleared. He glanced down to look at his injury. It was nothing more than a small cut, maybe about an inch or so long, but when he looked back up at the hero killer, he watched his tongue protrude from his lips straight toward the stain of his blood on the dagger. He just knew. His mouth filled with the ghostly rust of his own blood, and he knew he'd fucked up. The villain licked the side of the blade, and Midori felt his whole body freeze entirely. The sensation had hit him like a truck. It was nowhere near as horrible as the time that Shinso had frozen him. He could still move his mouth and his eyes. He wasn't trapped completely behind his skin, but Midori's heart still skipped a beat, in the painful manner where fear had squeezed his veins shut. He hadn't realized that he was falling until he suddenly crashed into Gami's soft robe instead of the pavement. He'd been frozen mid-step, so his balance must have given out on him, but he was so caught up in the feeling that his mind hadn't processed much else. Thankfully, Gami had planted himself in the way to leave him sitting on the pavement instead of lying on it, still able to see the hero killer as he approached him slowly. "Izuku, are you injured?" Gami stealthily had slipped out from underneath him, curling around his successor's petrified form. "I'm fine. A small cut, but nothing more. I can't move, though." He hadn't let the hero killer touch him, so the paralysis couldn't be touch-activated. He did manage to cut him, but he was still able to move in the few moments right after. It wasn't until he licked the blade. The blood consumption wasn't just some murderous tick, but rather his quirk. The hero killer had licked his blood, and immediately after Midori lost all control of his body. It was too much of a coincidence to just be a coincidence. Damn it, if only he'd known before. It was a powerful thing to hide. Most heroes weren't afraid of getting a little hurt, but in a one-on-one setting like this, it was game-changing advantages. And now Midori could do nothing as the hero killer had stopped just before him. "I'll admit, I'm impressed you lasted as long as you did." Neither Midori nor Gami could focus on the tainted praise, eyes locked onto the sword the villain held in his hand, having picked it up from where it was thrown off to the side by Midori's scythe. "You had some unexpected tricks of your own." Midori couldn't move. Even if he wasn't under the bind of the foreign quirk, he could hardly breathe. the air choking his lungs from its thickness. He was almost suffocating on fear, and yet he couldn't tear his eyes away from the sword, watching and waiting for the movement to come. If the hero killer had noticed his terror, he didn't mention it aloud. But your skills with the blade are pitiful. It's obvious to tell. You're afraid of using a dangerous weapon. A shame, really. I even got a little excited there for a moment. Midori was afraid of so many things. Before UA, he'd thought of being immortal meant that he could finally give up his fear. But instead he'd found that he was so ungodly afraid of so much more than he thought. Being immortal meant nothing. There was so much he could lose. It was such a fake power, a false hope, crumbling under the weight of its expectations. Your explosions may be versatile, but your close-range fighting style is a poor matchup for me. Midori was so confused. What was happening? When was he going to just stab him? He didn't know how much longer he could wait for the inevitable burn of metal in his gut. He didn't know how much longer he could wait until the hero killer tried to end his life, only to see him remain conscious while his body bled out hope and fear into the pavement. He just wanted to get it over with, because in the end, he was still a pathetic coward no matter what promises he'd made. In a final burst of horrified conviction, Midori looked up at the hero killer's face, only to find those nightmarish eyes staring straight through him. Gami was actively snarling, more than prepared to rip that sword right out of the villain's hands, and finally, something in him snapped. Something past his gritted teeth and terrified gaze and cowardice heart. Like a wave, Midori steeled over, determination crusting over his fear. Yeah, he was afraid of so many things, but he was far more afraid of losing the people that he'd learned to love than any sort of death that this world could inflict on him, and that fear was the fuel of his greatest promise. He could see the brief glimpse of surprise on the hero killer's face as his hardened eyes finally locked. He was ready. Stab him, slash him, do the worst that he could, and Midori would get back up because he had promised to fight to the end and then beyond. The murderer smiled at him, but this time it wasn't one of the smiles that had long haunted his hours, but rather a new smile, one of tainted admiration. Midori decided right then and there he didn't like it at all. Still, with you there's the potential of a true hero. There is worth in keeping you alive. A true hero. Midori was nothing like that. He was a selfish, pathetic person, wanting Ida alive because he couldn't afford to lose anyone else, clinging to the remnants of Ida's kindness even after he clearly didn't want him around anymore, regardless of some curse of his. He was selfish for wanting to still have closeness in his life, when all he was doing was putting his friends and family in danger. A true hero, huh? It's funny. Midori used to think certainties like that existed too. The hero killer moved, but never raised his sword, sparing Midori his immortal life as he finally moved past him and to Ida, just a few feet behind him. The teen's heart stopped in his chest. No, Ida was still going to die. He'd done nothing. He'd done absolutely nothing, and what? Ida was going to die because he didn't fit into this idea of a true hero? Ida was going to die because he didn't fit into this black-and-white philosophy that felt so painfully familiar? Midori watched the sword rise above Ida's head, and the words came spilling out before he could even think about stopping them. I used to think the same way you do, completely in black and white. He practically yelled them out, desperate to get through to the hero killer like Kiori Ryoyami had gotten through to him. I used to think that way because I was selfish. Thinking that way let me judge the worthiness of others without guilt. The hero killer paused, the sword still eerily hovering above Ida's paralyzed form. Midori had refused to waste the semblance of an opportunity that presented itself. It was those same thoughts that led me to revenge, because I thought he was a bad man with no way to redeem himself. Look, kid, I know I screwed up. I don't need you to tell me more than I have to hear it. It was a bad decision, but I can't take it back now, can I? He couldn't stop his grimace at his own admission. There was no such thing as a true hero, and if there was, then Midori was really the farthest thing from it. Are you really that spineless? Didn't you learn the first time that your actions have consequences? He missed the way that Ida's eyes had widened at his statement, though. But he was the one that showed me that way of thinking was wrong. He showed me that good can coexist with bad. No one else seemed to understand or want to help him. I can't blame them, but I was all he had left. I couldn't leave him too. Kiori Ryoyami had broken him that day, but Midori was more than glad that he did, because along with him, Kiori Ryoyami had broken that cursed ideology that he'd been using as a crutch for so long. I didn't want to hurt anyone. I just wanted to help my brother. God, I'm so sorry. And maybe something deep inside Midoriya's soul had hoped that he could be the Kiori Ryoyami for the hero killer, too. It's not about motive, or the reasons that drive us, he bellowed out alongside his deeply rooted fears and shame. It's about what we do with that drive, the actions that we choose to make that truly define us as heroes. as people. But he'd learned from that day. I don't expect you to ever forgive us, but I swear that we'll change. And he had a feeling that he wasn't the only one who did. Everything fell silent, stuck in a limbo of tension and thick air. Midori swore his heart was beating so loudly it was going to burst from his ribs. No one noticed the way that Ida's expression shifted in such a disoriented agony. The hero killer returned his sword to his side, leaving Midori in bated breath. Had he really managed to get through to him? Could this all end here, in a way that wasn't in blood and death? The villain turned sharply, and without a word he advanced back toward Midori, each step purposeful and intimidating, and immediately all the fear from before rushed back in full force. He stopped right at his prone form and dashed all of Midori's hopes as he grabbed a fistful of his costume, hoisting him lifelessly up into the air. He couldn't move, still paralyzed by his quirk, but he was paralyzed by fear regardless. All he could do was stare right at the hero killer's impassive gaze, wondering if he was about to feel the bite of metal in his stomach. Gami snarled and growled like a rabid animal, poised to strike at a moment's notice, ready to rip the man's throat out. Feeling the temperature drop further than what was typical around the ghost, the teen grit his teeth and summoned what little bravery he had left, a spark of toughness still left in his eyes. He looked right at his mentor, trying to communicate that he was going to be all right. He wasn't going to die. He couldn't die. There was nothing the hero killer could do to him physically that would matter. Of course, that did little to ease the fear still bubbling in Midori's blood, but Gami didn't have to know that. The hero killer finally moved, but it wasn't the hand with his weapon. With slow, deliberate steps, he carried Midori off until he reached the wall of the alley opposite to where the other hero was still slumped, and with something that almost seemed like gentleness, he set the boy down, leaving him sitting out of the way and with no harm. Midori wasn't sure what to feel anymore, whether that be shock, fear, relief, or some unholy combination of it all. He could feel the hero killer's gaze, still locked on him, but he refused to look up any more, afraid of what he might see now. "You're a much truer hero than I gave you credit for," he finally spoke, the monotony of his voice settling like fog. "To admit your wrongdoings and strive to right them." He didn't even have time to process any of this, as the hero killer turned away once more, heading back to Ida. "As for these two, they've let their imperfections drive them, and for that, they don't deserve the title of hero." Midori watched the grip on his sword grow tight and lost his fight against his desperation. "Stop! If you kill them right now, how can they ever right their wrongs?" But that didn't sway the murderer from his path, stopping in front of Ida. "Even still, there must be a line drawn somewhere, or else fake heroes will continue to fester." "Stop!" He locked eyes with his friend, and for the first time in a long while he didn't see hate, but rather the watery look of shame and fear. The hatred had been broken, and in return something vital in Midori's heart had broken too. He struggled wildly to move his body as the hero killer had lifted his sword once more. "Damn it! Stop!" It wasn't a command. Far from it. The cry was a desperate call of a child who'd lost far too much and couldn't afford to lose anything more. It was a weak, sad attempt to hold on to the little he had left. It rang in Gami's ears, completely overpowering the yell of his instincts to remain at Midori's side. "I meant every word. I want to stay." And so Gami had left, springing right at the villain. As he plunged his sword down upon Ida's head, but before it could pierce the boy's skull, the ghost had yanked hard on the hero killer's long and tattered scarf, causing him to stumble out of the blue and stab nothing but air. "What the?" But before he could question anything, the rush of fire and ice had flooded the alley, sending the hero killer retreating out of the way. Midori's gaze shifted from Ida to the other end of the alley, eyes widening at the familiar head of dual-toned hair. "Izuku, these kinds of things need more detail." Todoroki pocketed his phone, keeping his eyes locked onto the villain at the other end. "I was almost too late." And suddenly, new hope bloomed in Midori's heart, watching flames pour off his left side mesmerizingly. "Shoto!" he cried out in such pure, childlike relief. Todoroki stepped forward, guarding Ida with his body. "It took a moment to realize what you meant with your location, but in all the times that we've talked, you've never sent a message like that, so I figured you were in trouble, and I came straight here." With a twist of his right foot, a wave of ice had covered the alley floor. The hero killer jumped back again in caution, but the ice didn't follow him. Instead, it curved in a slope, sliding both Midori and the other hero toward Todoroki, safely placing them behind him, where they could be guarded alongside Ida. "In a couple of minutes, the pros I alerted should be here too." Todoroki shot a burst of flame in the same direction, making sure that the villain would not dare to proceed forward. He easily dodged, but true to the intent, he remained far back from the group. Midori glanced upward, stuck on the side from the awkward way that he slid down the ice, still paralyzed, but when his eyes met the beautiful dance of red flames in Todoroki's hand, he felt safe. He finally felt safe. I won't let you kill them, hero killer. Thank you, Izuku. I promise I'll never let you down again. He was finally safe. The murderer only extended his tongue in response, immediately returning fear to Midori's blood. Shoto, don't let him cut you, he warned, uncaring of hiding the hero killer's closely guarded secret. Pretty sure he paralyzes people by ingesting their blood. Todoroki nodded. So that's what all those weapons are for. Don't worry, I'll keep my distance. But he was interrupted by a dagger thrown right at his head, just barely managing to dodge. It scraped the side of his face, leaving a long cut in his cheek. In his shock, he wasn't prepared for the hero killer to finally advance toward him with tremendous speed. You've got yourself some nice pals, haven't you, Ingenium? Midori cried out as the villain ruthlessly swung a large blade at Todoroki's neck, only for a large chunk of ice to stop it in its tracks. Shoto! He relies on feints! Todoroki followed his attacker's gaze upwards, only to see a sword barreling down at him from above. He moved to block it with his ice, but was caught off guard as the hero killer suddenly grabbed him, pulling him in to lick the blood off his cheek. Startled, Todoroki lit up in flames, sending the villain back once more, completely forgetting about the sword above him. But Gami didn't, ramming himself into the blade and causing it to clatter to the floor far from the other. Again, the hero killer had frowned in confusion, picking up his weapon and inspecting it briefly, before charging again, which also snapped Todoroki out of his stupor, setting up another ice blockade. Why? You two, please stop. Midori straightened his gaze to Ida, who lay near him, mouth clenched tightly and tears trickling down his face. The guilt in his voice plucked at his heartstrings, and he swore some dissonant chord in his chest had echoed as one of them broke. This is all my fault, so please, let me accept the punishment I rightfully deserve. Todoroki paused in his movements for just a moment. The punishment you deserve? He then sent out another massive wave of ice, almost completely blocking off the alley and splitting it in two. You made some bad decisions, Ida. I hurt you. I almost killed you. I tried to, so don't tell me it's okay. It's not okay. And although the hate that fueled you may not have been your own, I can't even bear to look at what I've done. You still have to make amends for your actions. You should hate me. Why don't you hate me? The hero killer jumped from the wall of ice, but Todoroki held firm. That is the punishment you deserve, not dying in some warped sense of justice. Thank you, Izuku. I promise I'll never let you down again. The ice wall before them had shattered, sliced into pieces with ease. Todoroki prepared another handful of ice to force the villain back, but a set of knives had buried their way into his flesh before he could, effectively quelling the flames for a second. And that was all the hero killer had needed. Falling from above, sword poised to spear the boy right through. Shoto! Midori cried in desperation, begging his limp body to just move. Almost like a direct response, the paralysis finally let up, returning him to his full spectrum of movement, and that was all Midori needed, rocketing himself into the air and right up to the hero killer, grabbing a scarf as he pulled the villain into a new path of fall, dragging him along the walls of the alley in the process. Izuku! Todoroki yelled out, clutching his wounded arm. Even with the murderer as his cargo, Midori still turned back to try and glance at his friend. I'm not sure why, but I can move normally again. Todoroki pondered the new development. A time limit. But the other paralyzed hero had shot that down. Can't be. He was the last one to go down, and me and the other kid still can't move. The villain elbowed Midori hard in the back, causing him to wince as the pain had ricocheted up his spine. He lost his grip on the scarf, tumbling to the pavement as the hero killer had slid further back. He didn't have a chance to rush in for the attack, however, as Todoroki shielded Midori with a small wall of ice, calling for him to fall back. He didn't argue, retreating back to Todoroki's side, though not without a little stumble. He can paralyze people by ingesting their blood, but for my paralysis to have worn off while theirs hasn't, I can only think of a few things. Midori slipped into deep analysis, Todoroki keeping careful watch to make sure the villain didn't go in for a hasty attack. 1. The more people paralyzed at once, the shorter the effect. 2. The less blood ingested, the shorter the effect. Or 3. It varies based on blood type. After he finished his thoughts aloud, the hero killer laughed almost joyously, his lips curling into that haunting smile from before, filled with tainted admiration that left Midori's skin crawling. You know what? I'll give it to you. It is based on blood type. Fortunately, that's the one option where we don't gain any type of advantage, Midori sighed. Todoroki shifted closer to the other. I want to take the two of them and go, but if he can evade both my ice and fire, there's no way that he'll give us an opening to run. He let go of his wounded arm, wiping the blood off the back of his pants. We just have to keep stalling until the pros arrive. Midori glanced nervously at Todoroki's arm, watching how blood leaked profusely despite the knife still being embedded into his flesh. "You're losing a lot of blood, Shoto." Todoroki tried to play it off, but Midori didn't miss the way it hung limply from his shoulder. "I'll take his attention at close range, but I need you for long-range support." He bent his knees slightly, ignoring the way that his body screamed at him to stop. The other looked over worriedly, but otherwise steeled himself. "Just focus on hit and run, Suzuku. I'll make sure that he doesn't catch you off guard." Midori met his eyes, shifting closer to his side. Even in a situation like this, there was something so comforting about Todoroki's presence, something that instinctually screamed safety. His aura always felt so peacefully warm, and maybe that had something to do with his left side, but Midori had always attributed it to the warmth of his kindness that he'd been blessed with. "Friends, Izuku." Then they faced the hero killer dead on, side by side together. "We will protect them." "Friends, Shoto." The villain spared them no further time, racing forward with a set of blades drawn. Midori rushed up to meet him, propelled by a double blast, Todoroki's fire shielding him from the side in case of another feint. But the murderer's attacks were different now, more outright, more violent, more bloodthirsty. Finally realizing that he wasn't going to faint, Midori tried to dodge the swing but couldn't avoid the sheer brutality of the attack, faltering as his other leg was completely sliced open. "Izuku!" Todoroki cried, sending out another burst of flames. Terrified by the sudden change in behavior, Midori raised his hands instantly, firing off a double blast to blow the stained blades out of the hero killer's hands, as well as help him retreat back to Todoroki's side. But he didn't account that his blood might also be splattered by the shockwave, and just as he fell back in pain, he lost total movement once more. "Shoto, I'm sorry." Todoroki stepped up further to keep Midori's prone form shielded, firing a wave of ice to try and push the villain back. "Please, stop." A pathetic beg came from behind. "Enough!" Todoroki followed up with a pillar of fire, the very flames dancing off his body hauntingly. "If you want us to stop, it's your power, isn't it? You decide who you want to become. Then stand up and fight. Fight for the hero you want to be." The hero killer had dodged the blast of fire and cut his way through the ice, towering over Todoroki in all his terrifying might. He leapt around the follow-up flames, aiming his sword under Todoroki's arm. "Has no one ever told you?" He pulled up, preparing to cut off his arm entirely. "You rely on your quirk too much." Todoroki grimaced. There was no way he could move in time. Midori screamed. There was no way he could move at all. Gami lurched. There was no way he could get there before. And Ida roared. There was no way he would let his friends be hurt anymore. His engines boomed as he was finally freed from his paralysis, launching forward with an armored kick that snapped the sword clean in two. The hero killer had shielded himself from the shrapnel of his own destroyed weapon, and that was enough of an opportunity for Ida's engines to rev up another kick right at the villain's head, sending him reeling away. Midori couldn't stop the elation from spilling out. "Ida!" Todoroki swallowed his breath of relief, simply giving Ida a pleased smile as he ran a hand down his injured but still connected arm. But Ida didn't share in the pleasantries or the joyousness of relief, bowing his head for shame, and he tried to hide the remnants of his tears. "For wrapping you two up in something that you have nothing to do with, I truly apologize." Midori knew what he was trying to say, but he did have everything to do with this, with the hero killer. They'd been quarreling since the beginning of his murder spree, whether the villain recognized that or not, and he'd failed. He'd failed 17 times before, but he hadn't failed this time. Hero killer 17. Himself, 1. "And that's why I cannot allow you two to spill any more blood." Midori knew what he was trying to say, and he agreed 100%. No one was going to die today. The hero killer scoffed loudly enough, and he was heard from his distance away, discarding his broken sword. "Trying to make me believe that you'd had a change of heart is futile. A man's true character doesn't change so easily." And despite his paralysis and therefore almost total helplessness, something in Midori drove him to argue. "You're wrong! The world forces us to change every day. It's about accepting those changes if they can help us, or sticking to our own morals if the world tries to threaten them." The villain shot him an intensive, piercing glare, right at Midoriya, and if he could move, he would have recoiled back in natural fear. Todoroki shifted a little more, making sure that he was well placed between the two. "You're defending nothing more than a fake who prioritizes his own selfish desires. There will always be cancers of this hero society, and someone needs to correct that." Todoroki jumped in this time. "Don't pay him any heed, Ida. He doesn't get to decide who gets the chance to change and who doesn't." "No." Ida clenched his fist hard, blood from his stab wound to the upper arm trailing down in a slow splatter to the floor. "It's just as he said. I'm not qualified to bear the name of a hero." His voice was racked with guilt, wet and sticky like the streams of blood against his costume. Nevertheless, I can't afford to fold here. He looked up, and even from the floor, Midoriya could clearly see the burn of new life in his eyes, the drive of shame, sorrow, and purpose. For if I were to fold, I'd never have the chance to right my wrongs or to change what I've become. That would be the easy way out, and Ingenium never fought for what was easy, but what was right. The hero killer seemed provoked by Ida's declaration, but any chance at attack was dashed by a blast of fire from Todoroki. "You idiots!" The downed hero behind them all yelled out. "The hero killer's only after me and the other kid. Just run!" "Do you see him giving us any openings to do so, sir?" Todoroki snapped back, struggling on his own to hold back the bloodthirsty murderer. He's clearly shifted moods from before. He knows his advantage is dwindling, but he's refusing to retreat, despite his quick-to-flee type of tendency. He's making a serious goddamn effort to kill you both. His philosophy is being threatened. Midoriya suddenly filled in, eyes downcast. If he lets Ida and the other hero live, he has to admit that his thinking is not only flawed, but that he took lives in false justice, and when you've gone so far in black and white, it's easier to just keep going than to try and turn around. Midoriya understood how much it hurt to break completely and to have to build back the pieces all over again. He understood how much easier it was to live with tunnel vision rather than recognize the damage that he'd done, the countless lives that he'd unjustly judged and categorized, because it was easier for him. It was easier for him to work each day without thought, because thought hurt, and it was always easier to avoid pain than not. It was terrifying to realize how close he'd come to mirroring the man before them all. First almost Shigaraki, now almost the hero killer. It was a sickening tendency to his that would continue no longer. And yet, just like the hero killer was so desperate to retain his beliefs, Midoriya refused to allow his to yield as well. Once he started looking at it, there was a surprising amount of gray in the world. Ida tried to advance forward, but only pitiful puffs of smoke came from his engines. "Todoroki, are you able to adjust your temperature?" "Not with my left. Why?" Another burst of flame had slowed the hero killer's assault. "Cool down my engines, but don't plug my exhaust pipes." Fed up with the chatter, the villain tossed a knife at Todoroki's chest, determined to incapacitate the only thing keeping him from his victims, but Ida suddenly dived in the way, catching the blade in an unarmored part of his arm, and without a moment of hesitation, he dived for another, larger dagger, shielding Todoroki again as it buried into his hand. "Just do it!" he commanded before Todoroki could reprimand him. Midoriya could only watch as the hero killer grew closer, and his friends were still struggling. He needed to move. He needed to be there. He'd promised to protect them. He'd promised to fight until the end and beyond. He'd promised to bring a happy ending to an otherwise tragic tale. His body snapped with rejuvenation, finding himself again free from the paralysis quirk, but even then his motive was more than compromised. "Are you really going back in there?" Gami argued, helping his successor to his feet. Even in his ghostly arms, the teen still stumbled, unable to put much, if any, weight onto his left leg. "I have to." Todoroki iced Ida's engines. "I have to fight." The hero killer barreled even closer. "Because right now," Ida pulled the blades out of his flesh with his teeth. "I'm needed." Midoriya blasted out of Gami's arms, flying right at the villain from his side, just as Ida had suddenly approached from the other. He extended both of his hands, flattening out his palms just as Ida had swung out his leg with breakneck speed, and with a cry that shook paradise itself, Midoriya fired a double blast with such a resounding echo against the alley walls it could be heard by all of Hosu. The explosion threw the hero killer hard into Ida's kick, which connected with his abdomen right after, the sheer force now tenfold. Immediately after, sudden numbness had shot up both Midoriya's arms, the almost unfamiliar sensation catching him off guard and worry. Had he accidentally forced out a blast because of his emotion? He thought he had complete control over the technique now, and he didn't even think that he could force out a blast unintentionally, but the feeling in his arms proved otherwise. Damn it! He hoped it wasn't long-term this time. There was no recovery girl out here, not on the battlefield, not even in Hosu. He couldn't afford to be taken out now. Unbeknownst to him, Midoriya was worried about his fried nerves moving him from the fight. The hero killer had recovered in a brief rush of adrenaline, swinging the blunt end of the sword in his hand right at his head. And just as his eyes caught sight of his impending doom, Ida rushed in, breaking his course with another unyielding kick to his spine. He poured the last of his engine power into the blow, the hero killer finally still long enough for Todoroki to hit him with a pillar of fire, torching his entire body. Before Midoriya and Ida could impact from their freefall, Todoroki grew an icy slope to catch them, sliding them back down to the ground safely and behind him once more. As the hero killer's body touched the ice, however, the frost grew around him to hold him in place, keeping him pinned to the alley wall. Todoroki did not falter. "Stand up, he's still—" But the villain did not move, hanging limply from his rack of ice. The fight was over. They had won. Is he unconscious?" Midori stammered, trying and failing to pick his body back up. "It would appear so." Todoroki let out a sigh of relief. "Let's restrain him and hand him over to the pros. Is there anything that we can use to bind him? Encasing him in ice will send his body into shock." Midori perked up, reaching for one of the pockets on his utility belt. "Yeah, I've got a set of handcuffs." He didn't have a set of handcuffs. He'd used them yesterday during the night patrol in Yamanashi, and he'd never gotten them back, of course, just his luck. Todoroki noticed the pause and waved a hand dismissively. "Don't worry about it. I'm sure that there's something in one of these dumpsters we can use." "You focus on that. I'll start to disarm him." Ida rose as Todoroki allowed the hero killer to slide down the ramp and to his feet. Midori moved to try and help, but his arms still burned and buzzed. Although they were significantly less numb than just before, he figured the effect wasn't long-lasting then. He guessed this level of control was enough to partially manage the power of the blast as he unconsciously had forced it out. This was only the result of some nerve tremors then. That was a relief. No recovery girl was needed. Still, with his heavily wounded leg, he was stuck in his awkward half-sitting position against the ice. "Izuku, are you all right?" Todoroki asked, realizing that he had yet to still stand. Midori laughed awkwardly, laced with some of the adrenaline and anxiety that had been festering in his blood. "The last blast messed up my arms a little. I think I'll be fine in a bit. Can't really feel them right now." Todoroki had glanced down at his injured leg, watching precariously as blood had continued to ooze out of the wound. He then stepped forward, extending out a hand. Midori didn't hesitate to take it, interlocking their fingers, and in the short moment that they were together, something warm had settled in Midori's heart. Something of safety, of comfort, of peace, something that blocked out the entire world and only left the two of them. It was completely overwhelming, yet he didn't stop the feeling from overtaking him. Midori stumbled to his feet, but remained standing. Worried, Todoroki let go of his hand, quickly wrapping it around his shoulder instead. "Are you sure you can stand, let alone walk?" But it was his turn to wave him off, now summoning his scythe in his other hand. "Yeah, I'm good. I'll just use this to walk for now." The hesitance was clear in his heterochromatic eyes, but Todoroki gave in, nodded briefly before walking away, presumably to go look in the dumpsters for something to restrain the hero killer with, and once he was far enough away, Midori had turned to his mentor, who'd been waiting patiently and silently at his side. "So, I might need some help." Gami sighed, but he could never really be mad at the boy. "Of course. I will not let you fall." He wrapped his ghostly arms around him, keeping him steady as he took each step forward. "Are you truly all right?" He gave the ghost a soft nod. "Other than my leg, honestly, yeah, this is not the worst state I've been in, and I can already feel the numbness wearing off." "Somehow that is less reassuring." Midori smothered a laugh, knowing neither his hat nor collar would be enough to shield it. He was surprised that the hat had managed to stay on the whole time, with all the bouncing, jumping, and falling he was doing just before. He had to thank Nezu once he got back to UA, and then subsequently request something a little more practical. He stopped walking once he reached Ida, who was in the process of amassing a pile of sharp blades off to the side. With Gami's help, Midori bent down and began helping Ida to strip the hero killer of his weapons, and with each knife he tossed away a little more life had flooded his fingertips. They'd finished double-checking the villain for any other tools that he might have been hiding just as Todoroki approached him, and was holding out a coil of rope in his hands. Behind him stood the other hero, finally freed from his paralysis. The two of them had binded the hero killer tightly, looping the rope multiple times to make sure that he could not escape. Once they were finished, Todoroki took the end of the rope like a leash, dragging the murderer's unconscious body out of the alley with little care. The other hero, who Midori learned was native, offered to carry him after noticing him favoring his right leg, but out of some mixed amalgamation of spite and pride, he refused. His arms were practically back to normal again, the sensation having faded in just under a few minutes, and now that his motor skills were less compromised than before, he stubbornly chose to continue using his scythe as a cane, wanting to walk out of the alley alongside them as a sign of victory. It really had to do more with his personal pride, however, as his sign of victory was Ida's living, breathing body and not the cold light of his soul in his hands. Native sulked in shame beside them as they treaded out. "I'm sorry. I'm a pro, and yet I was just a burden on all of you." But Midori shook his head. "No, in a one-on-one fight against the hero killer's quirk, I don't think there's anything that you could have done. He was just too strong." Flashes of red and silver entered his vision again, and the stench of rotting flesh started to creep forward, but he quickly pushed that all aside. The fight was over. No one had died today. Even 3-on-1, we barely managed to win by the skin of our teeth, Todoroki agreed. And that was only because of the mistakes that he made himself. He forgot about Izuku's quick recovery and completely underestimated the raw power of both Ida's speed and the shock waves from Izuku's explosions. They all swallowed heavily, finally stepping out of the alleyway and back into the light of the street. It was truly a miracle that they'd all managed to survive. "What the hell are you doing here?" Midori turned, recognizing the voice, only to see one furious Gran Torino barging toward him, but after the harrowing ordeal he'd just gone through, seeing the angry pro filled him with relief rather than fear. "Gran Torino!" The elder stomped up to him, seething lightly, but calmed after noticing his wounded leg. He placed his hands on his hips and dropped his shoulders in defeat. "Well, I don't know what happened, but for the time being, I'm just glad you're all right." He was all right. Everything was okay again. More pros appeared from the area that Gran Torino had come from, all corralling around the small group, and upon realizing who Todoroki had dragged behind him, as well as the multiple injuries of the party, they scrambled into overgear. One moved aside to call an ambulance, another pair had moved to take the restrained villain from Todoroki's hold. Todoroki looked around, realizing a familiar face was missing. "Endeavor isn't here. Is he still fighting against the Nomus?" One of the pros nodded. "Yeah, we came in here because our quirks don't work well against those villains." Regardless, Midori was just relieved. Here they all were, surrounded by pros. The hero killer was defeated. Nothing bad was going to happen anymore. Everything was going to be okay. "Both of you." Midori turned back around, leaning into his scythe, only to see Ida in a deep bow, head downcast, hair overshadowing his eyes in guilt. "You both sustained wounds because of me. I'm truly sorry." The dark spot hit the pavement below, but unlike all of his previous premonitions, this time it wasn't red. "I was so blinded by my overwhelming hate." Ida's disheveled hair had hid the pain in his eyes, but it couldn't block the tears trickling down his cheeks. "I pushed you away." Midori's heart skipped a beat. "Does that mean you don't hate me anymore?" Ida wasn't prepared for Midori to tackle him, holding on to him so tightly it was like he was afraid of losing him. He wasn't prepared for Midori to start laughing so joyously he could raise the sun with the sound alone. He wasn't prepared for Midori to start crying so openly it could have been mistaken for the simplicity of rain. He wasn't prepared for Midori to hug him like he missed him. I'm just so happy to have you back, Ida." He wasn't prepared to weep harder at his words. Todoroki only smiled from the outside, letting his friends have the moment that they so desperately needed. He finally let out the breath that he'd been holding since the end of the sports festival. They were all right. Everything was all right. It was all finally okay again. "Duck!" Midori perked sharply at Gran Torino's yell, only to see the monstrous winged Nomu from before heading straight toward them. He could hear cries around him, but he couldn't make out the words. Stuck staring at the two beady eyes of the creature permanently fixed on him, he thought he heard Ida beside him gasp out, and that's what had kicked his body into overdrive. He dropped his scythe to the floor, pushing Ida to the ground with it. He just got him back. He couldn't lose him again. Midori could only choke on air in retaliation as a large claw had grabbed him by the torso and squeezed the life out of him before taking him off to the skies. "Izuku!" All the street lamps down the road had shattered. The Nomu ascended higher with another powerful flap of its wings, blowing Midori's hat off his head and back down to the earth below. They were getting so high he could barely make out his friends, the pros, his mentor. He struggled in its tight grip. One of his arms was caught in the claw and pinned to his side. But what would he do if he managed to escape now, plunge to his death and die? He wasn't sure Gran Torino could reach this level of altitude, catch him if he did. The Nomu turned a corner, and the last thing that Midori saw was the equally frightening sight of the hero killer rising to his feet, before he lost sight of everything entirely. He struggled pointlessly, kicking out his good leg in hopes of maintaining a strike to the monster, but what good would it do? The Nomu had seemed intent on taking him with it, but a creature like it had nowhere else to go in the burning hellscape that was Hosu. Nowhere but back to its creator. "I want to hear that little heroic facade of yours break. No. Why do you keep going when no one's here to save you? No. I'll just take him to Sensei. He'll know what to do." "No!" Midori couldn't reach the Nomu with his free hand at this angle, at least not anywhere that would completely incapacitate it, so he desperately had resummoned his scythe, back to his hand, struggling to hold its weight in midair. He could fall and live from such a height, but he couldn't defend himself as a pile of flesh and bones, so he anxiously had waited until the Nomu was stupid enough to fly over a low-rise building, and with all the fear and might left in his blood, he swung the scythe up, hoping his pitiful strike would manage to catch its wings. The deafening screech of agony that followed was enough of a warning for Midori to brace himself for impact. The teen rolled out to the edge of the roof that they landed on, the Nomu losing its grip on him as it barreled into the concrete. The scythe had been dislodged on impact, but the injury, as well as the crash itself, was enough of a distraction. The Nomu was screaming at this point, crying out animalistically as it wept from its pain, far too preoccupied to worry about its lost cargo. Midori unsummoned his weapon before starting to drag himself away. His leg was far too injured to stand on, much less walk, but he could have made do with his scythe as a cane if it weren't for the new injuries that he received. Deep gashes spread across his sides from the Nomu's claw. His lungs heaving from exhaustion, his pinned arm hadn't been spared either, now bleeding heavily along the roof, and the crash itself had surely broken something in his chest by the way that he wheezed painfully with every breath. He couldn't pick himself up. He could barely muster the strength to crawl, but the overwhelming fear in his blood had pushed him to get away, to get back to safety, to Ida, to Todoroki, to Gami, where he knew it was safe. He could hear a ripping sound behind him, one he never hoped to hear again. He crawled faster, ignoring the way his body screamed in protest, ignoring how blood had only seeped from him quicker. He was at the edge of the roof. There was nowhere left to go. He didn't dare look behind him, his heart far too petrified of seeing that purple void once again. He couldn't. He couldn't do it. Not again. I hope you can explain it to me. The scar on his wrist had throbbed. Falling off the roof would probably knock him unconscious at the very least, but anything was better than seeing who he knew was reaching for him right now. Midori pushed himself over the edge, bracing for the jolt of either splattering onto the pavement or Shigaraki hoisting him back up, but he felt neither. Instead, he felt the jolt of the hero killer catching him mid-air, carrying him under his arm as they landed, before settling him down rather gently behind him on the street. The hero killer stood almost defensively in front of him, wielding a small dagger that had gone unnoticed as he and Ida had stripped him of weaponry. Midori tried to pick himself back up to run or fight or anything other than lying helplessly, but his body refused, shutting down from overwhelmingness. High on the roof above, Shigaraki exited Kurogiri's portal, the mist man following suit. They stood right on the edge of the roof, now stained with the boy's blood, staring down at the duo below. Shigaraki rolled his eyes in annoyance. Of course you'd be here. Nothing can ever go the way I want, can it? He ignored the deafening cries of his injured Nomu behind him, focusing his hateful stare at the murderer below. The hero killer did not respond, continuing to hold up the blade unyieldingly, but from his close proximity Midori couldn't miss his soft wheezing. Again he tried to stand. Again his body failed him. I wish one of my Nomu had found you and picked you off. He continued rather casually. I'm so tired of hearing about hero killer this and hero killer that. It gets so old after a while. But my Nomu tearing up all of Hosu, now that's much more interesting. It was already hard enough for Midori to breathe, but the sheer tension in the air squeezed his lungs like an old towel. Blood was beginning to pool around him, drenching his costume heavily. At this point it was probably enough for him to start feeling the effects of death by blood loss, exhaustion, heaviness, poor coordination. He could barely think straight, but even then his body knew what to be afraid of, unconsciously starting to tremble from more than just blood loss. Through sheer terror alone, the teen managed to finally pull himself up, now sitting in his blood instead of laying in it. His head immediately started spinning from the sudden movement, unable to focus on what to prioritize first, quelling his bleeding or attempting a desperate escape. Instead, he sat and heaved, unable to stop the slight shaking in his hands as Shigaraki's gaze had settled onto him. Even from behind that disgusting mummified hand on his face, Midori could tell he was smiling. But I see you have something I want. How thoughtful of you. Maybe we can work something out after all. I want to hear that little heroic facade of yours break. What? Why do you keep going when no one's here to save you? Want? I'll just take him to Sensei. He'll know what to do. He was never going to leave him alone, was he? Midori wanted to cry, to break down and bawl like he was 4 again, but his body just didn't have the energy to spare. He'd barely managed to escape last time, and the only reason he did was because All Might showed up to save him. He didn't think that he was going to get an All Might this time. Shigaraki bounced on his heels like an excited child, and somehow the image only made him feel sicker. The villain clapped his hands together, and the sound had made Midori flinch into his skin. How about we make a trade? Shigaraki leaned over the edge of the roof slightly, eagerly peering at the duo below. If the hero killer reacted at all, Midori couldn't tell. You're in a pretty bad spot here. Injured with heroes right on your tail, Kurogiri here can warp you somewhere far away. He could even bring you back to the hideout for Sensei to heal you before you leave. You can keep going on your pointless side quest. All you have to do is hand him over to me in return. For as brave as he tried to pretend to be, something in Midori broke, some last piece of childhood innocence. He knew firsthand how terrible the world was, full of death and violence and injustice, but somehow, some little piece of hope remained, a sliver of belief that maybe he could make things a little bit better, and maybe he could be a light at the end of the tunnel, a symbol. For as much as he tried to distance himself from All Might, some small part of his childhood had still held on to those dreams. But now, as he fought against the water building behind his eyes and the pathetic whimper climbing up his throat, he felt fear kill the last shred of youth that he had left. This was the real world, the hero world. He had to get away. He had to try, but he could barely manage to slide a few inches back before his body had wavered. Even if he did just keep moving, the hero killer could catch him easily. He was just dragging himself away like a pitiful worm. It wouldn't be hard at all to stop him, and against a promise of escape and healing, Midori knew that he didn't stand a chance, so like a coward, he accepted what was to come, clutching at his wounds if only to shield himself a little more. The hero killer moved, but not back to grab him, but rather forward, brandishing the dagger in a threatening motion. Even from behind, even without seeing his expression, Midori could feel the waves of intensity rolling off his form, completely smothering the air in thickness. He is a true hero in this society overrun by fakes. I won't allow a childish lowlife like you to taint the change that he will bring to the world. Midori didn't have time to feel surprised as Shigaraki's responding anger flooded him with a new wave of panic. All your nonsense about a conviction. Just shut up already. Shigaraki made a threatening move in response, edging toward the edge of the roof. You won't hand him over? Fine. You really think that low-level weapon of yours is going to stop me from taking what I want? The hero killer did not grace him with any thoughtful silence this time. It's more than enough to call your pathetic excuse of a life. Sensing the brewing animosity, Midori readied himself to summon his weapon. He didn't think that he could properly hold it up in his current state, much less swing it, but God be damned if he was going to give up without a fight. On his own, he didn't stand a chance, but with the hero killer on his side, he was only going down kicking and screaming. Kurogiri, who had been painfully silent throughout the whole ordeal, had finally stepped forward. The heroes are quickly approaching. We can secure him another time, since they would not be pleased if we were wrapped up in this any longer. Shigaraki groaned with exasperation and returning annoyance. I hate having to wait, but fine. He turned away from the edge of the roof, away from the hero killer, away from Midoriya. You had your chance. Maybe I'll get to read about where they lock you up. That'd be a nice way to end this shitty night. Kurogiri created another one of his signature purple portals, walking through it leisurely. Shigaraki moved to follow before turning around once more to face the two on the street. His eyes met the hero killer's, and though Midori could not see what was communicated in their stare, by the way the villain in front of him grew slightly more defensive, he was more than ready to see Shigaraki go. Shigaraki sent a dismissive wave, and the teen almost wanted to wave back if only to tell him to leave faster. See you soon, Midori Izuku. Shigaraki entered the portal, and the swirling vortex had closed as quickly as it came, leaving Midori with shivers running up his spine. He was left sitting on the pavement, clutching his wounds, trying to gather his thoughts. The hero killer in front of him breathed out raspily, sending the teen's blood pressure spiking. But the villain made no sudden movements, seemingly trying to catch his breath just as Midori was, his mind strained against the overload of his thoughts, his heart racing as he tried to comprehend what had just happened. The hero killer saved him. He had an opportunity to escape, either by taking Shigaraki's offer or just leaving him to fend for himself, but he didn't. And now, too, why was he staying here? Midori could barely move. There was no way that he could stop him if he ran now. Izuku! His thoughts were interrupted as Gami flew straight through a building and nearly crashed into him. The street lights on this new road had started to flicker ominously, but Midori had barely paid them any mind as he was swamped by his mentor. Izuku, are you hurt? Did he hurt you? Midori wasn't sure how to respond with the villain in such a close proximity, so he merely shook his head, gesturing lightly to his bloody arm and side. Gami cursed loudly, moving his successor's hands to examine the wounds. Do not worry, the pros are right behind me. And sure enough, an entourage of heroes came running out of a nearby alley and poured into the street. Their gasps and calls were enough to capture the hero killer's attention once more, and he silently stumbled around Midori to face them. Izuku! Midori! He recognized those voices, and, craning his neck, he could make out both Ida and Todoroki in the crowd. What were they doing? They were seriously injured. They should be getting medical attention right now, not scrambling to find him. He would always be fine. He couldn't die after all. I'm okay. Midori ignored how much of a lie that was, sitting in a pool of his own blood. It was a lie they all accepted loosely. He was responsive, and that was good enough until they all got to the hospital. One of the pros had commanded the group to assume a battle position, and that immediately riled up the hero killer again, making him inch closer to them and further from Midoriya. He took the opportunity to calm the anxious ghost. None of these are from him, just from the Nomu as it grabbed me. He actually saved me from Shigaraki. Saved you? Kami was dumbfounded, and the rest of the thought had hit him. Wait, Shigaraki was here. Did he hurt you? Again, Midoriya just shook his head. He never got the chance. The hero killer wouldn't let him. They both looked up, watching the tense stalemate between both parties as both had waited for the other to make the first move. Let me help you up at least. I'm not sure if this will end calmly. Kami hooked his hands under Midoriya's arms, and they were in the process of making the movement seem realistic when a burst of fire came from another alley. The area had warmed considerably as Endeavor, adorned in his hellflame, strolled out angrily. The Nomu went this way, he started aloud before the whole situation in front of him hit his thoughts. The hero killer! Endeavor rushed forward, preparing a massive fireball in his hands, completely ignoring the gravity of the tension, but Gran Torino raced out to stop him. Todoroki, stop! The elder held out an arm. He has my student. Endeavor hesitated, and that was all the hero killer needed, stepping forward as his shredded mask finally peeled off his face, foam dripping from his gaping maw. Another phony. Everyone in the area was immediately paralyzed, but not by the hero killer's quirk. A wave of overwhelming fear washed over them, gluing them to their spots in the street. Midoriya nearly stumbled back to the ground. He would have if it weren't for Kami making sure that he stayed upright. He trembled in the ghost's grasp, unable to pull himself back together to stand on his own. The fake must be rectified. The villain took another step forward, the horrific look in his unguarded eyes piercing the crowd. Someone must stain himself in his blood. Even Endeavor recoiled, more than put off by the sheer display of tenacity and fervor. Midori couldn't help but imagine the hero killer's expression, the only one not able to see it. His imagination ran farther and faster than he could stop, filled with the snippets of his visions and nightmares as the mixed scent of blood and rotting flesh had creeped back in his mind. His heart started to race once more, charging unstoppably through his veins. Kami curled away submissively, almost hiding behind his successor. Midori wasn't sure if the trembles running across his skin were Kami's or his own. The word hero must be restored. He took one more bold step forward, and the entire group took one terrified step back. Come, just try it, you fakes. Something greater than fear oozed off him at that moment, as he faced down a slew of pro-heroes with only a small blade. It was no longer fear that infected all of them, but the terror of madness. The only one allowed to kill me is All Might. No one could move. No one could do anything as the hero killer had made his declaration. All of them stuck, paralyzed in a prison of their own flesh and bone, hearts beating, blood rushing, lungs choking. A sharp metallic clang echoed along the street, and the clean blade in the hero killer's hand had dropped to the pavement, snapping everyone out of their oppression. The villain himself did not react, frozen in time before them all. He wasn't even breathing. Endeavor was the first to speak, but even his voice came out soft and weak compared to normal. He's lost consciousness. Most everyone had dropped to their knees, completely overtaken by relief and overwhelm. Midori was one to follow. His heart was racing in his chest, threatening to burst out of his ribcage and splatter on the asphalt. His ears pounded with the rush of blood and adrenaline, but as it all started to wear down, Midori stumbled. His leg was still bleeding profusely, blood running down in waves. His arms couldn't hold in all the blood leaking from his sides, red starting to spill out between the gaps. Something in his chest had ached with every breath, his lungs spent from barely managing to keep his breathing through all the bouts of immense terror. It was all finally over, and that included him. His body just couldn't last one more moment. He didn't have the energy to mutter out silent apologies, simply reciting them in his head as he collapsed with a hard thud to the ground. All right, everyone. This concludes Chapter 42 of Deku and Death. Chapter 43 will be next. Hope you all are still enjoying this one, and as always, thank you all so much for listening.